For centuries, the Ottoman Empire projected an image of invincible grandeur, endless armies, golden domes piercing the sky, caravans of spice and silk stretching from Vienna to Baghdad. Poets sang of its justice, architects raised mosques that still defy gravity, and sultans styled themselves shadow of God on earth. But inside the walls of Topkapı Palace, in the labyrinth known as the Harem Humayun, a very different empire functioned. It was smaller, quieter, and infinitely more lethal. Here, desire was politics, beauty was currency, and a single whispered word could mean promotion or death. And on one winter night in 1640 or 1641, the exact year wavers in the sources, the mask slipped completely. Sultan Ibrahim, called Deli Ibrahim the Mad, woke from nightmares of betrayal. Convinced his 300 concubines were laughing at him behind their latticed windows, he issued a single command. At dawn, silk-robed girls and women, some barely past childhood, others veterans of 20 years in the gilded cage, were dragged from their dormitories by black eunuchs. No one dared ask why. They were marched barefoot across frozen marble into the moonlight courtyard. The palace fountain, fed by mountain springs, had turned to black ice. One by one, weighted sacks were slipped over their heads. Some screamed, most did not. 300 bodies, the number varies between 280 and 350 in contemporary reports, disappeared beneath the surface. When it was finished, the water ran red for hours. The corpses were loaded onto boats at midnight and dumped into the Bosphorus inside sewn sacks. Destined for the abyss, the Turks called Gludanes, the Dead Sea. European ambassadors wrote home in horror. The Venetian Bilo reported the event in cipher. The French ambassador's secretary counted the sacks himself from the embassy roof. Ottoman chroniclers buried the story in euphemism or omitted it entirely. But the whispers never died. Fishermen still claimed, centuries later, that on certain nights the strait grew strangely calm and pale hands reached up from the depths. People call it rumor. It is not. This was only the most spectacular eruption of a system that had been devouring its own for 200 years. The machine is born when Mehmed II, called Fatih, the Conqueror, rode through the shattered gates of Constantinople on the 29th of May 1453. He did not simply take a city. He inherited a palace already designed for secrecy. The old Byzantine Great Palace with its maze of corridors, hidden doors, and sea-walled dungeons. Mehmed kept the bones and added new flesh. The harem was not an afterthought. It was engineered from the beginning as a biological insurance policy for the dynasty. Ottoman succession had no fixed law of primogeniture. Any son could claim the throne, and most did so by strangling his brothers with a silk cord the moment the crown touched his head. To reduce though never eliminate the bloodbath, the sultans gradually withdrew from public life and entrusted reproduction to a closed, hyper-controlled environment. Every woman who crossed the gate of felicity lost her past the instant the iron doors closed. A Circassian girl named Alexandra became Gulbahar. A Venetian captive named Cecilia became Nurbanu. A Ruthenian redhead named Anastasia became Kösem. Their old gods, languages, and memories were scraped away like dirt from a diamond. They were given new lessons instead. How to pour coffee without letting the sleeve brush the cup. How to laugh without showing teeth. How to kill with a hairpin if necessary. Beauty was mandatory, but intelligence was the sharper weapon. The Valide Sultan, queen in all but name, at the apex stood one woman, the Valide Sultan, mother of the reigning Padishah. During the period historians call the Sultanate of Women, roughly 1550 to 1656, the Valide was often the true power behind the throne. Hürrem Sultan, the laughing redhead, who began as a slave named Roxalana, broke every rule. She persuaded Suleiman the Magnificent to marry her, an act almost sacrilegious for a sultan, bore him 6 children, and engineered the execution of his firstborn son by another woman. When Suleiman died, Hürrem's son Selim II took the throne, and for 16 years the empire was steered by a former concubine's letters, written in a Slavic accent. Her successor, Nurbanu, a Venetian foundling, ruled through her sickly son Murad III and amassed a fortune larger than the imperial treasury. And then came Kösem, perhaps the most formidable of them all, a Greek girl who rose to Valide not once but twice, first under her son Murad IV, then under her grandson Mehmed IV. She was strangled in her bed in 1651 by order of her own daughter-in-law, Turhan, who wanted the title for herself. The pattern was always the same: bear a prince, keep him alive, eliminate rivals, survive long enough to place him on the throne, and then rule through him until the next generation repeated the cycle. The eunuchs, keepers of the keys, no one entered or left the harem without the permission of the Kizlyurkosk, the chief black eunuch. Castrated as boys in Upper Egypt or Abyssinia, the operation was brutal and many died. They were sold to the palace while their wounds were still raw. Inside the harem they wore white turbans and robes of breathtaking richness. Outside, they commanded regiments, controlled provinces, and sometimes grew richer than viziers. The greatest of them, Hatshepsut Aga, served for 35 years across 6 reigns and orchestrated the fall of sultans and grand viziers with a flick of his fly whisk. Eunuchs were the only men allowed to see the women unveiled, the only ones who could carry messages between Valide and Sultan, harem and divan. Their loyalty was absolute because they literally had nothing left to lose. The concubines, pawns who could become queens, a new girl Gizdi, in the I began at the bottom. She slept on the floor with 30 others in a long dormitory. If the Sultan noticed her during his rare nocturnal visits guided by the Valide's subtle nudges, she became Iqbal, fortunate one. One night of favor could change everything. A pregnancy elevated her to Cadin, official consort. A living son made her potential Valide, but every step upward was a target painted on her back. Poison was common, a pinch of diamond dust in the sherbet, a needle prick from a friendly hairpin. Strangulation was quieter, 2 deaf-mute women sent in the night with a silk cord. Miscarriages were induced by accidental falls down marble stairs or by secret doses of saffron and rue. Infants suffocated in their cradles beneath 2 heavy quilts. And always the ultimate threat, the sack and the sea. Ibrahim the Mad in the night of the 300 sacks. By the 1640s the system had grown rotten with its own excesses. Ahmed's decision to end fratricide and lock princes in the Kafes, a luxurious prison inside the harem, produced a generation of sultans who had never seen a battlefield or a woman outside the palace walls. Ibrahim was the worst, released from the Kafes after 22 years of solitude when his brother Murad IV died. He arrived on the throne paranoid, obese, and sexually insatiable. He demanded furs so thick his bed looked like a bear's den. He ordered the fattest woman in the empire found and brought to him. She weighed over 300 pounds and became Becker Perhattan, sugar slab. His mother Kösem still ruled as Valide, but Ibrahim resented her. When rumors reached him that his favorite, a musk-scented beauty named Zivakar, had taken a lover, the Sultan's mind snapped. In his fevered imagination every woman in the harem was conspiring against him. The drownings were not impulsive. Orders were issued days in advance. Eunuchs prepared the sacks and weights. The chief gardener was told to break the ice on the fountain. Only a handful of senior women, Kösem herself, a few trusted Iqbals, were spared. When it was over, Ibrahim wandered the empty corridors laughing and weeping by turns. Less than 8 years later, the Janissaries dragged him from the same palace, strangled him with his own bowstring, and threw his body onto the midden heap outside the gate. The myth and the reality to Europeans. The harem was an oriental fever dream of naked houris lounging on divans. Painters like Ingres and Delacroix fed the fantasy. Languid odalisques, steamy hammams, all soft flesh and coal-lined eyes. The truth was colder, harder, more magnificent in its terror. It was a factory for princes and a graveyard for princesses who never were. It produced some of the most remarkable women in history: stateswomen, patrons, murderers, saints, and devoured thousands whose names were never recorded. The last valid sultan of consequence, Besmelem, died in 1853. The harem itself was abandoned when the court moved to the European-style Topkapı Palace in 1856. The old corridors of Topkapı fell silent. The fountain in the moonlight courtyard still runs, clear and cold. On windy nights, the guards say, you can hear wet silk dragging across marble and the faint splash of something heavy slipping beneath the water. The children who never saw the sun after the sacks sank in 1640, the harem did not empty for long. Within weeks new caravans arrived from the slave markets of Cairo, Kaffa, and Venice. The machine demanded fresh blood, but the real terror now shifted to the princes locked in the caves. When Ahmed I spared his brother Mustafa from the traditional fratricide in 1617, he thought he was showing mercy. Instead, he created a new kind of hell. From that moment on, every prince who was not chosen as sultan was imprisoned for life inside a gilded suite of rooms deep in the harem. No windows faced the outside world. Guards stood silent at every door. Visits from their own mothers were rationed and watched. They grew up pale, half mad, obsessed with birds and clocks, because those were the only things that moved freely. Some never learned to ride a horse or hold a sword. When their turn finally came, often after decades, they emerged blinking into sunlight like cave creatures, terrified of open spaces, surrounded by viziers who had spent years plotting how to control them. Osman, too, young and brave, tried to break the system in 1622. Only 17, he decided to lead a campaign against Poland himself and to disband the Janissary corps that had grown too powerful. The harem elders and the Janissaries united against him. They dragged him from the palace, cut off his ear as a trophy, and strangled him in the Yedikule fortress. He was the first sultan murdered by his own soldiers. His crime: trying to be a real ruler instead of a harem puppet. After Osman, the Kafes princes became even more broken. Ibrahim himself spent 22 years there, listening to his brother Murad scream at night from opium dreams, hearing the bowstring snap on cousins he had played with as children. When Ibrahim finally became sultan, he was already insane. The drownings were only the most visible symptom. The final queens, Turhan, Hadis, and the last bloodbath, Kösem Mopikar Sultan, the Greek girl who had ruled as Valide for 3 reigns, was now nearly 70. She had survived poison, exile, and the execution of 2 of her own sons. But she refused to hand power to her daughter-in-law Turhan Hadis, mother of the new child Sultan Mehmed IV. For 4 years, the 2 women waged secret war. Kösem controlled the Janissaries. Turhan controlled the palace eunuchs. Spies watched spies. Coffee cups were tested on dogs. Hairpins were examined for hollow tips. On the night of the 2nd of September 1651, Turhan struck first. 22 assassins, some say deaf mutes, others say Albanian mercenaries, burst into Kösem's apartments. The old woman fought like a lioness. She bit one man's thumb off, clawed another's face, and tried to hide inside a cupboard. They dragged her out by her long white hair and strangled her with her own curtain cord. Her body was thrown into a well beneath the harem, then quietly buried at dawn. Turhan Hadis became the last great Valide Sultan. For 32 years she ruled the empire through her son and then her grandson, building mosques, crushing rebellions, and slowly moving the court toward European ways. She was the one who finally ordered the cave sealed forever and replaced fratricide with simple seniority. The eldest male would inherit. The worst of the old terror ended with her. The slow death of the gilded prison. By the 18th century, the harem was changing. Sultans began to marry free Muslim women instead of keeping hundreds of slaves. The slave trade in white women collapsed after Russia crushed the Crimean Khanate in 1774. New girls came mostly from Georgia and Circassia, and they were trained more as companions than as breeding stock. The Chief Black Eunuch lost his political power after a disastrous coup in 1807. The Janissaries were massacred in 1826. Reformist sultans like Mehmed II and Abdülmecid started living in European-style palaces along the Bosphorus, taking only a handful of wives with them. In 1856, when Abdülmecid moved permanently to Dolmabahce Palace, the old Topkapı Harem was abandoned overnight. Hundreds of women and eunuchs were pensioned off or simply locked out. The marble halls that once echoed with bare feet and whispered plots fell silent. The last woman to hold the title of Valide Sultan was Pertevnil, mother of Abdulaziz. When he was deposed in 1876, she stabbed the leader of the coup in the face with a hat pin and had to be dragged away screaming. After that, even the name Valide disappeared. The ghosts that remain today, tourists walk through the harem in slippers, admiring Islamic tiles and carved ivory screens. Guides speak softly of the women's quarters, as if it were just another palace wing. They rarely mention the fountain that still runs red in old engravings. They do not point out the narrow staircase where pregnant girls were pushed. They never open the iron door that leads down to the cells where princes went mad counting the days on the walls with their fingernails. But the palace remembers. In the former apartments of the Valide Sultan, restorers sometimes find tiny bundles hidden behind wooden panels, locks of hair, a child's milk tooth, a scrap of silk embroidered with a single name in a language no one speaks anymore. Offerings, perhaps, or curses. Fishermen on the Bosphorus still refuse to sail near Sarabur Point after midnight. They say the current changes there, as if something enormous is breathing us beneath the surface. And every winter, when the first hard frost comes, the fountain in the third courtyard freezes in strange patterns, long pale fingers reaching up through the ice, mouths open in silent screams. The guards close the gates early those nights. They know the difference between wine and memory. The Ottoman Empire fell in 1922. The Republic banned the veil, emptied the palaces, and turned Topkapı into a museum. But some doors were never opened again. Some sacks never surfaced, and some are under the black water of the Bosphorus. 300 women in soaked silk are still waiting for morning that will never come.